One of the most populated royal burial sites is St George's Chapel, within the walls of Windsor Castle. As Westminster Abbey became home to many medieval kings and queens, there was a need for another royal burial site, as the abbey had become rather full. Was actually interred here very quietly to avoid any medieval king. Third wife Jane, Windsor Castle. As Westminster Abbey became home to many medieval kings and queens, there was a need for another royal burial site, as the abbey had become rather full. So St George's Chapel became this place, and over the centuries, many important monarchs were interred inside of tombs here. For example, inside of the choir, the notorious King Henry VIII, the six-wived Tudor king, is laid to rest alongside his third wife, Jane Seymour, and the executed King Charles I. The body of Charles I was actually interred here very quietly to avoid any chaos in the aftermath of the English Civil War. Also buried nearby are the remains of Henry VI, the murdered monarch of the Wars of the Roses, brutally killed inside the Tower of London, and his long-time enemy and nemesis, Edward IV. St George's Chapel, which have been disturbed and opened for differing reasons. And in this documentary, we look at the different burial vaults and discuss what happened as the coffins of the kings and queens were opened inside of St George's Chapel. And to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. The royal vault that sits under St George's Chapel today is considered full or close to it, with the coffins of dozens of royals and minor royals inside of it. But what is this, and what does it look like? As a building, St George's Chapel is known as a royal peculiar. Following the execution of King Charles I, the executed king was buried there alongside Henry VIII, who had been buried with his third wife, Jane Seymour, in a specially built vault. Further changes and restoration was made throughout the reigns of the Georgians and Queen Victoria. One of the first monarchs buried inside of St George's was Edward IV, and it stated that he was to be buried in a vault with a chapel or closest over it, with space for an altar and a tomb with his figure of silver and gilt. Then with the skull of this vault are a number of different shelves which are held behind iron bars, and today there are 25 bodies of members of the royal family who are buried in their coffins in this part of the royal vault. The bodies are literally slid onto the shelves and then have been left in this manner. One of the first people to be buried in the royal vault was Princess Charlotte in 1817, and she died following giving birth. The tomb house holds the remains of many different royals, including King George III, George IV, William IV, and many of their grandchildren, children, and other family members. The first to be interred in the royal vault was Princess Amelia in 1810, the daughter of George III and his wife Charlotte. There is near to the shelf a few central plinths, and these, the coffins of a number of kings and queens, were placed in the centre, highlighting their importance. Some images of the comes up and down, bringing coffins into the royal vault. Coffins are lowered to a chamber below, and this is connected to the royal vault. When the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II took place, the body of the Queen was lowered symbolically into said royal vault, using the electronic lift. Her incredibly heavy coffin was then brought back out of the vault hours after the funeral had taken place, because she was to be buried inside of a small chantry chapel alongside her father, King George VI, and her mother. The remains of Elizabeth II were then interred here. Philip, her consort, Prince Philip as he was better known, had his coffin held inside the royal vault for roughly a year, and this was done so that there would not be two separate interments inside of the memorial chapel. Someone must have known that the Queen did not have long left, or the plan ended, leading to the conclusion that the remains tend to stay in a good sense of preservation, and it was intended to be the burial place of her father, George VI, and her mother. The work for the chapel was significant, actioned for fire a few weeks after the death of Queen Elizabeth II. What is very shocking is the size of the body. Also in chamber beneath the chapel's floor. Margaret's ashes were fetched from the royal vault and were placed inside of her parents' tomb. Worship and adore. Then thou art Saviour. He was lowered symbolically into the royal vault. However, after the funeral, in a private service on the 19th of September 2022, at roughly 7:30 p.m, Elizabeth II was laid to rest inside of the memorial chapel that she herself had commissioned. The remains of Prince Philip were also moved into the chapel after the interment of the Queen's too. Interestingly, her coffin was made over 30 years before her funeral and was made of English oak and was lead-lined to attempt to keep off decay. There were 9 pallbearers needed to lower her remains into the vault due to the weight of the wooden coffin. The death of Elizabeth II was something that shocked the world, especially with the fact that many had only ever known one monarch of Britain on the throne. But what is not as well known, is deal, showing her importance. But Henry decided that he wanted to be placed, to begin with, in this vault, before he wanted to be moved to a much larger and grander tomb, which would be placed inside of Westminster Abbey, alongside his father and mother's tomb. The tomb of Henry VIII was planned for many decades before he died, and he wanted this to be a large ornamental tomb which would be bigger and would never occur. The coffin of Henry VIII after his death and embalming looked like, and the crown was. The funeral service of Henry VIII then occurred, and his coffin was then lowered into the vault where it stood. Charles I, 16th King Charles, was a strict and venerate him as a martyr. Because of this, work was being carried inside of the on the evening of the 12th. Sir Thomas More documented in his History of Richard XIV order at all and made, marking the site of his burial. To the deadliest civil war ever fought on a ring of prayer in the middle of the night, which nation that confirmed that he was a king.